And we're going to start things off a little differently tonight. Okay, move that up there. And let's do this. Let's go to that one. Okay, let's see, it's waking up. Anyway, while that's getting itself situated, here we go, display settings. Here's what we want, duplicate slideshow. Now we're in business. There we go, cool. Okay, last Sunday morning, I brought a devotional out of towards the end of the book of Genesis about the reunion of Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. The great family reunion and God working behind the scenes, bringing everything together. Now, as we look at these different things, Old Testament, New Testament through John, and as we talk about these things Wednesday night, sometimes we might wonder, well, okay, where is the exact connection with all this to 2022 and what's going on in our world? Well, little did I know that Joseph and his brothers being presented on Sunday, April 10th, was going to have an impact, not just here. And well, I didn't impact it, but there's something else going on that very same day. But quick refresher, a few years ago, taught a Sunday school class going through the book of Joshua. When after they come out of Egypt, they take the bones of Joseph with them and bury them in the promised land per his request. Here is Joseph's tomb in the promised land, picture taken in 1894 AD. Yeah. How did they get Joseph's bones? They took them with them on the Exodus. They did. Yeah. And in fact, when we excavated Joseph's home in Egypt, his tomb, no bones. Grave robbers don't take bones. They have no value on eBay. Yeah, they didn't have eBay back then, but Craigslist, whatever. Yeah, no. Yeah. So yeah, the bones were in fact missing, sure enough, because they were brought to the promised land. So that's all fine and dandy. And there it is without the tourists.
That's a real thing?
It's a real thing. Yeah. And so is this.
So wait, hang on a second. So Joseph is actually buried. That's the.
This is the understanding that this is Joseph's. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
We have tombs for other folks in the Bible too.
Okay.
Now, can I tell you guaranteed 100% that that is in fact Joseph in there? I have no way of knowing that one way or the other.
Right, yeah.
But to the best historical evidence and focus and emphasis for a long, long time, this has been recognized as Joseph's tomb. So these images show, as it says at the top, Muslims destroy tomb of Joseph, 7th of October in the year 2000. There is something called an, if I say it right, intifada, which is a Muslim basically action of aggression. And I don't want to get too bogged down into the weeds here, but this is referred to, this whole event that this is a result of, as the second intifada, the second wave of this action here. Yeah, so in 2000, Joseph's tomb was attacked by Muslims. Well, what does this have to do with, that's good for that. We can close that now. Stop that share, and I'm going to share something else. What does that have to do with us? There is Joseph's tomb Sunday, April 10th, when I was reading about Joseph and his brothers. And I'm going to actually read this article to us to show how this relates. So that picture is taken Sunday, April 10th, as Joseph's tomb.
It was already destroyed?
In 2000, it got rebuilt and restored.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so Joseph's tomb got attacked again on Sunday. As I'm reading about Joseph and his brothers, here's what was happening last Sunday. Yeah, while I was reading about Joseph and his brothers, here's what was happening to Joseph's tomb.
Oh, wow.
Same day. So here's the article by Jonathan Feldstein, a guy, one of the many people I follow. Here's his article. And this relates to why we look at these different things. It's a tremendous paradox that in the Middle East, only Israel protects the holy sites of all religions, Jewish, Christian, Baha'i, Druze, and of course, even Muslim. It's been that way since 1967, which we're aiming towards, when Israel regained control of Judea and Samaria and all of Jerusalem, the parts of the land of Israel, which I refer to as the original Bible Belt. But the paradox becomes a gross double standard when a Jewish site is attacked and desecrated, as happened this week at Joseph's tomb. It's not the first time Joseph's tomb was attacked. In October 2000, as we saw the pictures, Rabbi Hillel Lieberman set out on foot to protect the sacred site, the Torah scrolls, and other religious books inside, after hearing it was being attacked, desecrated, and burned. The next day, his bullet-riddled body was found outside Nablus, the biblical Shechem, where Joseph's, yeah. The author of this article writes, I remember it vividly because, not knowing that things were going to escalate as they did, my oldest daughter, who was 7 at the time, recorded a message that went out to our entire community appealing for funds to help Rabbi Lieberman's children. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Second Intifada, during which more than 4 years, more than 1,000 Israelis would be killed and thousands more injured. Who knew at the time that the victims would become too numerous to be able to raise money for each one's family? Sorry, let me move this down here. Joseph's tomb is not an insignificant, out-of-the-way place. Biblically, you'll recall that before dying, Joseph made his children promise he'd be buried in the land of Israel, from which he'd been physically separated, but which was always the center of his life. Sadly, Islam does not always accord such tolerance for other religions and their holy sites, or even houses of worship. The desecration of Joseph's tomb again this week is one of many examples. It's not just in Israel and Jewish sites. One doesn't have to think too far back to recall the desecration, along with murders, by ISIS on countless sites through Iraq and Syria. We'll touch briefly on that in Sunday school with Abraham's travels coming into the Promised Land. However, the desecration is especially egregious when it's combined with anti-Israel Palestinian nationalism that seeks to erase Jewish and Christian religious history from the land. And the targets are not just houses of worship, but actual biblical sites. The physical desecration is a byproduct of the theology that says Jews don't have a history in Israel. This is particularly ridiculous and offensive with the allegation that there never was a temple on the Temple Mount. There are people who say that, just like people are Holocaust deniers. I always reply that if there was no temple there in the first century, where was it that Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers? They not only undermine Jewish history and connection to the land, but Christian scripture as well. Some people refer to Arabs and Jews as cousins, even brothers. That's nice. I can get along with Arabs just fine, and I do. Even Islam recognizes this, but just twists the scripture. Don't know if y'all knew this, I didn't. Islam departs from biblical truth in Genesis 22, 1 through 19, where it says that Abraham took Ishmael to be sacrificed, not Isaac, despite the clarity of the verse. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall show you. Ishmael is simply not mentioned. As brothers, if they continued reading the scripture as Jews and Christians do, they would know that while God does promise that he will also make a great nation through Ishmael, the promises and covenant from God are to the Jewish people through Isaac and Jacob, including all the promises relating to the land of Israel. Remember, as I say, everything's about blood, everything's about land. It is something that's so clear that it should never have to be stated. But when Joseph's resting place is desecrated as if it were just a pile of stones, it needs to be shouted. Were Islam to continue past Genesis 22, they would read that after announcing to his brothers that he was their brother, which is what I read Sunday, and asking about the welfare of their father, Jacob, Joseph consoled them that what man meant for evil, God meant for good. The Muslims' desecration of Joseph's tomb is made worse by the fact that the world is not enraged. This is the worst kind of Arab racism, not to hold them to the same standard and expectations to behave in a way that is expected of others. Think about it. Were Israel to enter, much less desecrate, a Muslim site, holy or not, universal condemnation of Israel would instantly displace the headlines about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm not advocating for desecrating sites, God forbid, but Joseph's tomb is entirely biblical. It's the same pattern we see when Muslims oppose Jewish and Christian visits to the Temple Mount, much less prayers there. If religious sites should not be desecrated, how much more so biblical ones? Today, we're seeing a wave of terror in Israel that coincides with Ramadan. We're in the Muslim holy month of Ramadan right now. Sadly, this is a typical pattern in Israel, where Islamists use their holy month to kill, maim, and desecrate. Not all Muslims behave this way, but enough do, which makes one question whether Islam really is the religion of peace. Will the wave become a flood, a tsunami, or the third intifada? Nobody knows. The world must be called out for turning a blind eye to the desecration of Jewish holy and biblical sites. It is not just a double standard, it is an anti-biblical heresy. And that should be alarming to Jews and Christians alike. Let us not forsake Joseph by letting this happen in silence. So everyone saw this happening in the news, right? No. No. So what's the point to all of that? These things matter. There is a spirit in the world that is trying to undermine the spirit of truth and the spirit of God, and the evidence that backs up everything we read in the scriptures. But Bible says Joseph's bones were taken and placed in Shechem, Nablus, there they are. And so people who are contrary and anti the Judeo-Christian God, some of them go to great lengths to erase history. If you want to replace a society, you erase their history, their foundations. It's what's happening in America. It's happening. These things are not coincidences. So we know that people can try to, destroying the evidence does not destroy the truth that evidence represents. The truth is unchanging. What happened, happened. The same God of Joseph is the same God of us today. Nothing changes what we have, but this is just an awareness that these efforts are out there, which causes what we hold dear to be even that more dear and precious. And how important it is that we keep our fires lit and keep our focus strong in these things we know are right and true that people are trying to erase this rationally.
So did they stop them or arrest them or do anything?
I don't know how far they got with their damage, and if anyone's been arrested or held accountable, I do not know.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, you didn't hear any of this on the
No.
news. And I think the article's right. People should be outraged, right? Or
Yeah.
something. Okay.
So that's that. So let's now bring it to back to our study with our good friend, Mr. Jonathan Cahn, and looking at some of the stuff he's written about. Now, I was remiss in our last class because a question was asked of me in a class prior, and I forgot and failed to answer that. That question was asked. So who is this guy? Okay, he's a Messianic Jewish rabbi, so he believes in Christ, but great. But with all the stuff he's discovering and piecing together, what's his background? Who is this guy? So in the Harbinger Companion Study Guide, it actually lets us know a little bit about this guy's background.
I just want to say real quick, anytime I buy fabric, Eric buys one of his books. So that's an ill-gotten book.
Well, I often say the Lord and the church are the secret to the success of our marriage. There's a third secret. We have a mutual understanding. I won't look at her room full of unused craft items and say, you don't need to buy any more craft stuff until you use what you got. She doesn't look at my bookshelves of all the books I haven't read yet and say, you don't need to buy another used book until you've read what you've got. So we get along well.
Yes, I have to be very aware of, my own
Yeah.
purchases. Whether he sees them or not.
Yeah, that too. I do reconcile the checkbook. But anyway, so Jonathan Cahn, here's some background on him. He is of the line of Aaron. His father came from Germany, having escaped the Holocaust. His mother's family came from Russia, having escaped the Tsar. Remember, before Lenin overthrew Tsar Nicholas in the October Revolution, Tsar Nicholas had kicked the Jews out. Or Tsars before that. So both of Jonathan Cahn's parents were scientists. So at the age of 8, he became an atheist. About 13 years old, he's starting to be disillusioned with atheism. One day he picks a book up that he thought was on UFOs, but it wasn't. It was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Aha. That got his wheels turning. So all sorts of ideas he thought were non-Jewish, he now found speaking of the Jewish Messiah in the Hebrew scriptures as he's looking at these things. After a long search, he began to believe that only one person could be the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. So far, so good. So he actually, as life goes on, ends up almost getting killed twice. Once his car was swerving out of control and in and out of lanes of oncoming traffic. Appeared a miracle he wasn't killed. The second time, he was 19 and was coming up on the train tracks driving his Ford Pinto, first mistake. And I added that, it doesn't say that in here. There was no physical barrier stopping cars from the path of the train, and the road was rough. One might be on the track without realizing it. And he was on the track, didn't realize it. The train approached the intersection, plowed into his Ford Pinto with him in it. The metal in the car became like aluminum foil. The only thing he could do in that moment was call to God. The car was destroyed, but he didn't get a scratch on his body. So he decided that as he's 19 right now, he would accept the Lord and start following the Lord when he turned 20. 8 months later, on his 20th birthday, he committed his life to following the Lord. In college, he majored in history, started an outreach to the homeless in New York City, graduated college, was asked to help start an outreach called Beth Israel. A few years later, the leader of the outreach left the ministry. Jonathan was approached to take the position, and there were about 35 people in the congregation. Soon it doubled and tripled, and over time, Beth Israel became one of the largest messianic congregations in the world. Their focus, they're in New Jersey right now, restoring the original biblical Jewish flavor of the New Testament faith. They're in Wayne, New Jersey. World outreach ministry called Hope of the World, dedicated to spreading the word of God to the unreached of the world and helping the poor and needy of all nations. And he's ministered to audiences in tens of thousands and been to India, Latin America, Africa. He's spoken in Congress and all sorts of things. So that's a little bit of his background. Knew there's something I liked about him.
But he obviously is personally invested.
Yes.
In what he's.
Oh yeah, he practices what he preaches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which brings us to Are you ready? Grab your popcorn.
Is there an ancient mystery
Sorry.
that lies behind everything from 9/11 to the plague of COVID-19 to the forces that are now transforming American culture and world civilization? Are the shakings that have come upon America and the world a warning, a wake-up call of something yet to come, and that leads to calamity? You cannot be silent. You know what's coming.
So that is the new movie that's coming out on the studies that we're looking at. It's focusing more specifically on 9/11 and COVID stuff. The other books, I'm not so much, it won't be dealing as much with the Shemitah as I understand it, but that's coming out on Thursday, May 12th. So we'll make that our movie night for the month. And then I mentioned it was being playing over at Regal, Fathom event. Well, Galaxy just picked it up as well. So it's going to be playing at Galaxy on Thursday, May 12th. You can buy your tickets now. I already got ours. And so for anyone who'd like to make it.
Or if anyone wants to, we can get them too.
Oh yeah, we can grab them for anyone. Yeah.
Where is Galaxy?
It's in the Tulare outlet.
Here it's. I have these really plush. Oh, it's very nice.
Oh, it's very nice. Reclining seats. Yeah. So there's that to look forward to.
Okay, so this new movie is going to be based on
Our Wednesday night studies.
our Wednesday night studies. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So now let's get biblical and go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4.
You're a good PR guy for this guy.
Well, again, I don't care if we disagree with everything the guy has to say. That is totally fine. My goal is for us to look at the scriptures he's looking at so you can get familiar with the scriptures, because they're not scriptures that are commonly looked at. So it's good just for that, if nothing else. Have some discussion on that and be aware of the events building up to where we are now, and be able to see, could there actually be some patterns to these things? Do we see the Holy Spirit kind of working and weaving in some things? And the more we get, and if so, the more familiar we get with seeing the Holy Spirit work, as we've seen in this very church body, the more we'll recognize him as he's moving forward.
Oh, I think about it because I don't know, when I was growing up, it seemed like back, in the 70s, there was always these like Nostradamus specials that would
Yes.
come on, during the week, and we would watch them, and it was, predictions and all this stuff. So I remember those.
Yeah.
And it always seemed a little hokey.
Sure.
But kind of intriguing at the same time. And I see where this could kind of fall in.
Oh, sure.
Into that. But then he's definitely biblically based, right? And it's not some, he's some guy sitting there in a cave, having prophecies or whatever. He's looking into the Bible. And so when you were pointing out some of these things, and you laid that foundation about the land and these, I want to say like number, the 50, the
50 and 7, Jubilee and Sabbath.
It makes sense that God would work within that kind of order. That there wouldn't be just Harry-Carry. I mean, and obviously we understand God can do whatever, but that it would be loosey-goosey stuff. God would use these, I'm having trouble articulating.
God wouldn't have a 1/4 inch seam on the left and an 1/8 inch seam on the right.
Wow, it's scary that you even know that. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Unless you're in, right? Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. So this is kind of stuff that it, like I say, part of me is kind of like, oh, this is a bunch of hokey stuff.
Maybe.
And, but then I don't know, we see the patterns.
All scripture. First or second Timothy.
1 Timothy 3:16.
All scripture is good. That means the Old Testament too.
Yep. And again, we're Judeo-Christians, and 90% of the Old Testament is not the law of Moses. So it's still living and active and applicable today. And even the law of Moses has a lot of good stuff whose principles still apply, even if the letter doesn't. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, going to be talking about idols, and then going on to the Shemitah and economy and something on witnesses. But here in Deuteronomy 4:15-17, Moses tells the people, again, this is all for how they're going to be conducting themselves when they arrive in the promised land. Deuteronomy 4:15-17. So starting 15. So watch yourselves carefully, since you did not see any form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire, so that you do not act corruptly and make a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, and so on and so forth from there. The point is not that we can't have art, and art that depicts nature. The point is these aren't to be idols of worship. Don't make a statue of a man and bow down and worship it, statue of a woman. Baal and Ashtoreth that we read about a lot in the Bible. Well, they had their images that were worshipped. There's been moon worship, cow worship, all these different things that we've seen, especially from the pagan nations around them. Buddha, yeah, of that fat belly. Anyway, yes, all these things. So the Lord is saying, keep your focus where it needs to be. Keep your heart where it needs to be. As we love to say, we worship the creator, not the creation and all that stuff. When we look at the creation, we should honor the creator who made that, not worship the created thing. So very, very important there. So the warning, as he puts it, warning of God against idols, against the worship of false gods, making of their images. And then skip down to chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 9. Deuteronomy 5, 7. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. And then going on about showing loving kindness to those who love him and keep his commandments. So there's a warning here about falling into idolatry. God's jealous. In our marriages, we're supposed to be jealous for each other. Jealousy, I love how Sister Minnie brings out the difference between jealousy and envy. Diana, thank you. Knew it came from somewhere. And so very important distinction. Jealousy is healthy. God jealously desires the spirit he's placed within us, the New Testament says. Envy is resenting someone having something and wanting to take it from them, deny it to them and have it for yourself. Jealousy is desiring what is given to you in the first place. Husbands and wives should desire each other, be jealous of anything that interferes with that or is a threat to that. God has every right to be jealous over his people when we've made ourselves a covenant with him and a commitment to him. And so he's right to not take kindly to idolatry. Makes sense. Now, of course, we know we're not in the habit of making idols, but we all know full well that anything we put our focus on too much becomes itself an idol. So we get all that. One of the things that happened here was, though, as he puts it, the word of God got removed from the culture in Israel and the other gods were brought in, of course, lowercase g there. And we see that in America today. The word of God keeps getting pushed out and all these other things to focus on and worship come in fill of vacuum. Evil loves a vacuum. Evil loves a void. And so that's what happens. Take God off the table, anything goes. And so we see that happening. Fast forward to chapter 15. Just two verses, the first two. And this will be a refresher on the whole Shemitah Sabbath year thing, but I'm going to touch on an important aspect of it. Deuteronomy 15, 1 to 2. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. And we'll stop there. Points out this, there are lots of different words that we brought up that Shemitah incorporates in the fullness of its definition. One of them is a letting go or letting fall, letting go. So that aspect touches the economic realm. So in the 7th year, all debts are canceled. And I wrote a note to myself. So I guess no 30-year mortgages. Right. So they were very good record keepers. So everyone who has made a loan to someone has to annul it. Those in debt are released. Anything still owed is forgiven. All credit is nullified, all debt is wiped away, and this will become important as we get to modern times. All this takes place at the very end of one specific day, the 29th day of the Hebrew month of Elul, the last day of their civil year. Their civil year runs from Tishri, September, October, to Elul, August, September. So the very end of the 7th year, the last day, Elul 29th, it's the climax, the focal point, the finale of the Shemitah, the day when the nation's financial accounts are nullified. So it's at that moment it happens. Now, we recall this, Hebrew reckoning of time. The day doesn't begin with morning, but with night. Goes back to Genesis 1. Creation records there's first darkness, then darkness, night, and then the day. So every Hebrew day begins with the night before the day. It says night begins with sunset. Every Hebrew day begins that sunset the night before. So the moment that all debts have to be reckoned is wiped away is that sunset of Elul 29 going into Tishri 1 for the new year going forward. So makes sense? Everyone good with that? We're going to see that play out in modern times. Lastly, let's go to Deuteronomy 19, one verse. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. Deuteronomy 19:15, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Now, the point he makes with this is the 2 witness principle first applies, of course, to the legal realm. We get that court situation, witnesses, literally, sure. He makes the point, and it's scriptural too. It also applies to the realm of nations. A lot of the prophets were witnesses against the nation. And so before acts of judgment can take place on a nation, there have to be witnesses, 2, and more than 1, 2, maybe 3 witnesses at least, proclaiming the warning, because the whole point of a warning is to turn from the judgment that's to come, the calamity that's before you because of the path that's being taken. So all good with that? Amen. Yes, he did. He absolutely did. And he referred to the Father, he referred to the Spirit, his word, and all those things, his works, absolutely. So let's go through, pick up where we left off. We're in the 1920s, not going backwards anymore. So let's pick up in the 1920s with our wind down. And I appreciate your patience as it's not fun stuff. I said when I began this section that this makes me kind of sad. And I want to be uplifting. But this is some of the reality of what happened. While the roaring 20s were a time of great prosperity and it had a foundation, lots of people were unhappy and were turning to things contrary to God and were waiting for their opportunity. We got the Federal Reserve in that, and we'll talk about that as we go. But let's pick up with some examples of this. And I'll try to pass through quickly, but I don't want to blow through. I don't want to whiz past, but give anyone time they need to take in. So Jane Addams, anyone ever heard of Hull House or Jane Addams and the social gospel movement in the 1920s and all that? Well, she won a Nobel Prize for her efforts. Jane Addams in 1920 was the co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. She has a Quaker background, but turns out she absorbed very little Christianity. A quote of hers is, "Christ don't help me in the least."
Goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, that explains this look on her face. Sour looking face.
She has a resting, bless your, not quite a bless your heart face. Yes. Okay. And I've mentioned other references that I've used, that I'm using. I'm not going to go through that whole list. Feel free to see me afterwards if you're that interested, but yeah. So I won't bog you down with all that. So that's Jane Addams.
So what did she have to do with?
She is she's one of many examples in the 1920s of this rise against Christ.
Oh, okay.
This rise
And she started the American Civil.
she started the ACLU that is often in the news this very day. Yeah, she was part of that. So Something else, someone else not in America, but obviously an awareness and an impact, Mao Zedong, or also known as Chairman Mao.
He was bad.
Look at that baby face though.
He was bad.
Yeah, exactly. We forget that old people were once young, right? We forget that. Let's not forget, because I'm aiming there. So here's the note on him, and this is actually out of his biography. Although China's Mao Zedong was born to a peasant family, he trains as a teacher, travels to Beijing, where he works at the university library. What could go wrong here, right? It was at the university library. During this time, he begins to read Marxist literature. In 1921, when he's all of about 28 years old, he becomes a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party. It sets up a branch there in Hunan. So that's the start of that. And that's 1921. Who do we have next? This guy might ring a bell. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. In 1921, he attends the Second International Congress on Eugenics, which spawns the American Eugenics Society. You see, one of the things, if you take God off the table and special creation, you're left with humanism, and if you're left with Darwinism and humanism, well, evolution, it's not like we're all at the same level. No, some are better than others right now. And we might just want to speed up the process. Let's minimize the birth of the young. Let's kill off the old, and these inferiors, let's just do what we can to minimize their spread, however we might find ourselves doing that. So that's eugenics, which was very big in the progressive side of Nazi Germany and all that stuff. American scientists and eugenicists were corresponding with their counterparts in Germany. They were sharing notes. This wasn't just a Nazi thing. This was in America. Now, obviously, we did not have the Holocaust here in America. Do we have Margaret Sanger coming up?
Oh, man.
There's the very next slide. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. She was not in favor of abortion. That's important to keep the record straight on that. She was in favor of other methods. One quote from her: "Our living room became a gathering place where liberals, anarchists, socialists, and IWWs, international workers thing, could meet." So she wanted anarchists and socialists all to meet in her living room. She was a member of the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party. She had an affair with H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was a champion, in his phrase, of liberal fascism. That's his word, his phrase, that he was big on this stuff.
The guy did the H.G. Wells.
H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds and all
War
that?
of the Worlds.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. We'll get to him. Margaret Sanger advocates controls on the procreation of those that she deems unfit, including Jews and Italians. She denounces marriage as a, quote, degenerate institution. She endorses political assassination. She says the most merciful thing a large family could do to a new baby is to kill it.
What? Well, look at that picture though.
Unwanted babies are a ball and chain.
Ball and chain, yeah. Look at that. Oh my goodness.
Yes. Yeah.
Goodness.
Birth control and sterilization can be used to weed out the poor and blacks and Chinese, whom she likens to a plague. Plague. Yeah, they are a plague. She views birth control as a means of weeding out the unfit while aiming at the creation of a Superman. Eugenics.
But you know what, if you go like on Wikipedia though, it doesn't talk about any of this stuff. It said that she was trying to help people from having those unwanted babies. This was
It's what who she didn't want.
Yeah, a kindness kind of a thing, you
No.
know? Yeah, and that's what they want to do, you know, we have all these.
She actually said, we don't want the word getting, and she said this to a black pastor, we don't want the word getting out of what we're trying to do to the Negro race.
Right, yeah,
Well, you would have worked on the blacks
Mhm.
and the Chinese, the Italians. and the
apparently
Jews.
so.
Right.
Yeah. Even recently, Planned Parenthood has started taking Margaret Sanger's name off of things because of her eugenic past. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're trying to erase that history.
Sure.
Yeah,
Clean it up. Yeah.
yeah.
So the common theme here we have now, Ashley, one word, godless. Everything comes back to the reason I bring up anything is because it shows things are either going in a godly or godless direction. Always ask me if you don't know why I'm bringing something up or what the point is, what it has to do with us today, where does this have to do on the godly or godless scale? Some things don't matter. Some things matter very much. Whenever something comes up, that's the heart of the matter right now. Is it going, get to that and say, okay, which direction is this going?
Children are looked at as a burden, as something to.
Yet Jesus said, suffer the little children, allow them to come.
Disposable,
Inconvenience.
and inconvenient.
There's a great punishment in the law if you cause a woman to.
Yes.
ask the woman to leave her child.
In the law of Moses, if a pregnant woman is injured and loses the baby, yeah, there are penalties. There's recognition of the life in the womb in the Old Testament. Yeah. So, but touching on economics, because economics is not just about money. It's about how fairly and freely we treat each other in our society. It's a bigger picture than just money. The American Economic Association, their idea for establishing a minimum wage, which a lot of people think might be a minimum wage good idea. People need to have some foundation, some basis, some minimum standard, right? Idea sounds good. Why was minimum wage started in the first place in America? The idea of minimum wage, the American Economic Foundation, was so that the value of the unemployable's worth would lock them out of the market and accelerate their elimination as a class. We're going to set a minimum wage, not because we think the lowest working person should be paid that much. We're going to establish a minimum wage above them so that they can't get a job, so that they'll be phased out of life in society. Start to death. Here's a quote from one of them. E.A. Ross said this, quote, hence, if you raise minimum wages to a civilized level, employers wouldn't hire miscreants in preference to fitter specimens, making them, these miscreants, less likely to reproduce and, if necessary, easier targets for forced sterilization. I don't have him on here, but Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, in the case of Carrie, I forget her last name, forced sterilization, he said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And, yeah. So this was a big deal in this time frame. Which brings us to Mr. H.G. Wells. So this is now after the time, as I've mentioned before, where Harry Truman starts his first public office. The airport in Boston on Winthrop Island now becomes Logan International Airport. So here's H.G. Wells, cover of Time magazine. What a guy. Quotes from H.G. Wells, and I'll apologize up front for this. Swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people would have to go. It is in the sterilization of failures that the possibility of an improvement of the human stock lies. Yeah.
Well, I think it's who do they think they are?
Right.
Right? It's easy, yeah, it's just.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't sit around and think, how can I destroy society today?
Right.
You know, or.
Right.
Y'all have heard of George Bernard Shaw, playwright, another Nobel Prize winner? Well, you'll like this one, not. He advocates for the abolition of traditional marriage in favor of more eugenically acceptable polygamy, it gets better, under the auspices of a state department of evolution and a new eugenic religion. Yeah. So that guy got a Nobel Prize. Gonna go to this guy.
Who's that?
The Duke, Il Duce, Mussolini, there he is in the 20s. In 1923, journalist Isaac Markerson writes admiringly in the New York Times that, quote, Mussolini is a Latin Teddy Roosevelt who first acts and then inquires if it's legal. He's been of great service to Italy at home. So bragging about being like Teddy Roosevelt, who bragged about doing the same thing. I'm going to act and let everyone else figure it out afterwards, which doesn't show a lot of respect for society and the laws that, or anybody else. Yeah. Lincoln did that too. Lincoln was the gateway drug for Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt.
I mean, and I'm sure we can do a lot of good things.
Yes, he did.
Did that too.
He was big government.
Yeah, he was big government.
So that brings us to Vladimir Lenin passes away and is replaced by Joseph Stalin in 1924. And this is towards 1922, so just a couple years before Lenin passed away. So we have the changing of the guard in Russia. It's now, of course, it's still communist Russia, now under Joseph Stalin and no longer Lenin. But speaking of Russia, W.E.B. Du Bois. Why do I say speaking of Russia when I'm talking about a black guy in America? 1924, W.E. Du Bois. He's an anti-Semite in his early career. His magazines in 1924 start carrying a swastika on the cover. Yeah. He's a future co-founder of the NAACP. In 1926, he goes to Russia and he declares, and this is, remember, Joseph Stalin's Russia now, taken over from Lenin. Here's a quote from W. Du Bois. If what I have seen with my eyes and heard with my ears in Russia is Bolshevism, I am a Bolshevik. Yeah. There's a lot of contrast between him and Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was very industrial, very about earning your way and improving your way and moving your way through society versus a forced radical thing, and not quite where the socialists like W. Du Bois are. So I'm sure we've heard of this guy, Mr. Will Rogers, right? Funny guy, good guy. Yeah. Will Rogers in 1926, that same year, he visits Italy and interviews Mussolini. He tells the New York Times that Mussolini is, quote, some wop.
So what?
Wop.
Oh, no.
Oh, gosh, Eric. Yeah, it's a derogatory.
Yeah, more derogatory now, but he says, talking about Mussolini, I'm pretty high on that bird. Yeah. Cole Porter had a song, You're the Top, You're Mussolini. Ended up changing the lyrics to that. So what we're seeing here is we've got all these people, progressive, communist, socialist. They believe it's time for man to put aside the old-timey, old-fashioned ideas like natural law of there's a right way to treat people based on the God of nature who made us in our state of nature. Time to put away traditional religion, constitutional liberty, capitalism, and those things, and instead rise up and remake the world in our own image. Sounds like the Tower of Babel to me. We need to make this new religion which the people worship themselves. The mindset here is that individuals can't be free except as part of the group. Their existence lacks meaning and purpose except in relation to this collective. If people are the new God, there's no room for God himself. Loyalty to the state and loyalty to the divine must be seen as the same thing. In other words, for them to succeed at this, they can't have anyone or anything higher than this. So they have to replace anyone or anything that's a threat. God would be a big one, because all of this is godless. So they know that this isn't popular and not an easy sell. So what do? Stop me if this sounds familiar. They maintain a permanent sense of crisis. A heightened state of emergency, no time to argue. I put in my notes here to myself, the way I describe them, crisis hucksters, grievance hucksters. They have to whip up a problem so that they can be the solution. Now, I mentioned that book by Vera Gordon, what was his name? Vera Gordon Child, called The Aryans, written 1926. Talked about how in Abraham's day, those Aryans coming from the north with their horse chariots were superior to the Semites down below. So, hey, superior race here. That's where that whole Aryan thing came from. Well, borrowing a slide from way back when, here's the Garden of Eden and the four rivers, and where the swastika, which actually comes from Swahili, is based on the four rivers of Eden. About going back to purity, going back to the source.
Yeah, this is a thing, yeah.
Yeah.
A real thing, yeah.
And so the Nazi flag, which I'm not going to put up here, it's a black swastika inside a white disc and a sea of red. Each part means something. The red was to attract communists. Seriously, here's the quote. In red, we see the social idea of the movement. In white, the nationalistic idea. In the swastika, the mission of the struggle for the victory of the Aryan man. So that's where all this comes from their point of view, is we want to be social, we want to be nationalistic. Nazi stands for National Socialist.
Yes. So,
Yeah.
okay, but, okay, so we see where the rivers are.
Uh-huh.
How do we get, what goes along the red line?
Basically, if you take this and make it a grid, basically the idea is to take the fourfold garden and use that grid, think like a quilt pattern. And so we're going to take that grid, and along the margins, we're going to make this. The natural flow of the rivers do not fall into a swastika pattern. It's just that the idea of the fourfold rivers is what went into the Swahili idea of the swastika. There's a symbol in China for the ancient garden, the ancient walled garden. It's got the four directions too. The Taj Mahal is patterned on the Garden of Eden, where you have your center and the four rivers coming out of it. In the class I did, back starting creation with the Garden of Eden coming forward.
Was a symbol.
Yeah.
You know, that was used, that they co-opted. I guess you could
There's
say.
been symbolism
Yeah.
of the Garden of Eden and the four rivers throughout the ages. And it's been some to honor, some to, I won't use the word I want to use, but to corrupt and modify to your own benefit and purposes. Like the rainbow, yes. Now I want to eat Lucky Charms.
Oh my gosh, this is very great.
Yes. John Dewey. Want to talk about our school system and our education system. John Dewey is an atheist. Now, before I get to this, we're in 1928, but in 1927, that's when England said, hey, America, hey, Federal Reserve, can you increase inflation on your American citizens to help bail us out after we messed around with the gold standard? And we said, sure. And that's what leads to, and so artificially lowered interest rates, what builds this false bubble after the genuine prosperity that ends up collapsing when they have to bring the rates back up, and that causes the great crash of October 29. So that's set in motion by what they do in 1927. And you can read about that in the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression, which is, and the New Deal. Yeah, so great book. But anyway, so John Dewey, we're in 1928 now. He's an atheist. He's a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. He is big on Marxism and the progressive movement influence with it. He calls for a public top-down government managed socialism. The problem is that capitalism, again, we're talking about economics, we're talking about a way of conducting our affairs. I don't know if you've ever thought about it in this terms. I really appreciate this description. Capitalism is a spontaneous form of commerce. Spontaneous. It's arising from individuals voluntarily entering into economic relationships. Capitalism is not a planned economic system that's imposed on people by a government regime. There's no okay, we're going to institute a planned and capitalist, or it's an oxymoron. They have got nothing to do with it. It's like a cold hot dog, jumbo shrimp. It's got nothing to do with each other. You know? And so, but that's a problem for these people. And so they want authority, they want social engineering, they want big plans. That only works if it's imposed, which is everything contrary to what America was founded on biblically, with the respect for the individual and individual of liberty. Absolutely. So our whole setup was to empower the individual. And so this is why Marxism, socialism is un-American. People who subscribe to these things might want good things as an end result. This is an un-American way to get to that result. If your result is everyone to be okay, everyone to be healthy, everyone to be safe, everyone to be provided for, those are all good things to want. But there's a godly way to approach those things and an ungodly way. Force and coercion and socialism are ungodly. Yeah. Man's got it figured out. Man can make it work. So this guy says that the nation's youth must be freed from existing mores, values, belief systems, traditions, and customs, etc., through public education. We have to make them ready for another sort of programming. Classroom is a captive audience, millions of children, perfect setting for our Marxist indoctrination. Dewey's an early fan of the Soviet Union and its educational system and its propaganda efforts. Obedience and conformity is the new unity. He went to Russia. He went to Stalin's Russia in 1928. So here's one of the founding fathers of America's progressive movement. He is a celebrated hero in the education world to this day. And he praised Stalin's Russia for their brainwashing of the children in public school. Yeah. Shoot. I'm so glad you asked, because I asked myself that same question before tonight, and I forgot to look it up. So if someone wants to look up Dewey Decimal System, see if it's named after John Dewey, feel free. Yeah, because that struck my head. And you know what? I thought that's a question I would ask, but I forgot to look up the answer. It was out as soon as it was in my brain. So not trivial at all, because that relates to the education system. Yeah. So maybe, maybe not.
It was first published in the United States by Melville Dewey in 1876.
His little known brother. No.
But I was thinking that too.
Yeah, it's a natural assumption. Yeah, crossed my mind.
Yeah, Melville Dewey, who was 1851 to 1831, was an American librarian and self-declared reformer. He was founding member of the American Library Association.
Did he have a kid named John?
You say this guy could be a descendant.
Yeah. Against Truman, Thomas Dewey was the Republican. Let's see.
Oh, he was an anti-Semite.
Yep. Yeah, for the inventor of the Dewey Decimal System, C. Melvin Dewey. Let's see.
Melville Dewey, yeah, sexual harassment, anti-Semitism.
Oh my.
racism. Goodness, okay then.
Nope, not his parents. Okay,
Yeah.
so. Okay, so one of the things that, get back to that. So here's a quote from Dewey. The traditional customs and institutions of the peasant, his small tracts, his three-system farming, the influence of home and church, all work automatically to create in him an individualistic ideology. The great task of the school is to counteract and transform those domestic and neighborhood tendencies. In other words, the great task of the school is to counteract and transform against home and church and their influence on the individual and family. So speaking of education, so John Dewey was a big influence. You ever notice how the word kindergarten sounds German? It is German. Before Hitler and Germany, there was Otto von Bismarck and Prussia. Otto von Bismarck was very big on welfare state, socialism, and all that stuff. Hitler, learned from him and was made chancellor through him. But anyway, and so kindergarten was brought over to America through that model. And the quote from Prussia kindergarten is, "The government is the true parent of the children. The state is sovereign over the family." Have people made that argument in this last year or so?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
They're doing bills right now. Trying to pass that exact same thing
Nothing new under the sun.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing new under the sun.
And did you know that legally in California, a child does not have to go to kindergarten?
No, they do not match up for school.
And-
Child's
Kindergarten, yes. And I am so sorry. I just looked at the time. I don't have my glasses on. And so we'll close here.
Yes.
We-
I should have been.
Anyone feel free to, hey,
Brilliant.
Brother Cooper, this is great, but I have a life. So my apologies, but let's, it's prayer time. Is that what you said? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll end on a positive note here. Calvin Coolidge. With all this going on, keep in mind, the Roaring '20s were a good time for America, a very successful time based on a foundation, a godly foundation. Here's an example. President Calvin Coolidge, one of his quotes. "We live in an age of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our declaration. Our declaration created them. The things of the Spirit come first." Thank you, Calvin Coolidge. And so from there, we will pick up with going into the crash and depression and get back to the timing of the Shemitah with that and go on from there. So any final observations, thoughts, questions on what we've looked at this evening? Some good.
I mentioned Calvin Coolidge, and he said, "I do not choose to run," and you said he did not actually say he wrote it.
Yep, he handed it out on slips of paper. He was nicknamed Silent Cal. Some ladies over dinner made a bet that they could get him to say 3 words.
Oh.
And he looked at her and said, "You lose." So on that note, we'll stop our share, stop the recording, and end in our